Well, hello, and welcome to this new very special interview. Today's guest is probably one of the most important guests that we have ever had in this program. Winner of some of the most prestigious international accolades, Stephen Schwartz is one of the biggest musical theatre legends, author of such iconic shows like Wicked and Gospel. One of his latest creations is the stage version of Dreamworks' classic The Prince of Egypt, which is reopening this summer in London, and on which we will be focusing in this interview. Hello, Stephen. Welcome to our show.
Hi, Guillermo. So happy to be here and speaking with you.
We are very happy to be here talking to you too. And you also must be feeling very happy that finally, after, more than a year of having the theaters closed, after that, the Prince of Egypt is finally reopening. You must be exhilarated.
I am so exhilarated about it. The timing was so frustrating for that particular show because we had only just opened in the West End. I think we ran about 2 or 3 weeks and then we had to shut down because of the pandemic. And so, that was with a show like Wicked, which is, I think, reopening in the West End a bit later. It's opening in the middle of September, but it had been running for so many years that even though it was frustrating, there wasn't the same sense of having a kind of momentum interrupted. So it's really exciting that we're going to be back again, and I'm looking forward to when COVID restrictions allow me to get over there to see it again.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing it for the first time because, as you said, it was such a short run that I didn't just have the time, and I'm so looking forward to seeing this show. So, let's start by the very inception of this show. How did the opportunity of turning, this iconic cartoon animation film to make it into a stage show, how did it come to you? How did that opportunity come to you?
Well, over the years, people who I'm told were constantly reaching out to Dreamworks, various theater groups, community theaters, church theater groups, etc., would reach out to Dreamworks and say, is there a stage version of The Prince of Egypt? And of course there was not. And so then it turns out they started doing their own. And several years ago, I was working actually in Copenhagen with Philip Lezebnik, who was the primary screenwriter for the animated feature. And we learned that in a town close by in Sweden, there was actually a production of The Prince of Egypt happening. So unauthorized, needless to say. So we went to see it. And, we didn't complain about it and met the cast and the director and said nice things to them and didn't mention that technically they weren't actually allowed to do it. But then we got in touch with Dreamworks and just said, look, we've seen this and clearly there's something stage worthy here. And maybe we should consider trying to put together an official stage version of it. And Dreamworks, the powers that be at Dreamworks agreed. And so we began working on it. And then, like all musicals, it took several years to develop. But then we did a couple of, we did readings and developmental productions, as one will do on a big new musical. And then ultimately, the producers who have brought the show to the West End attended one of the developmental productions and thought that it was ready for a commercial production. and that's how that all came about. But several years in the making and development.
Hmm. Did you find it challenging to adapt such, it's a very epic tale. The story itself, it's very spectacular. So to bring that to the stage must be challenging. Did you find it that way, or did you say, well, no, piece of cake to me?
Well, it's actually the opposite challenge, and not a dissimilar challenge in a way from Wicked, which is the spectacle is there, and that is the directors and designers' responsibility in a way more than us as writers. You're entirely right. It's a show which involves plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and miraculous events and a chariot race and things which when you see them on stage, if they're done effectively as I believe they are in this production, it's very exciting. But at the heart, we need to tell an emotional story and a story of characters and relationships between human beings, and to have those relationships and that story not get swamped, if you'll pardon the pun, by spectacular effects. And as I say, Wicked shares a similar challenge because there are, big scenes and big numbers, but in the end, it's a story about these two women and their relationship. Prince of Egypt, at its heart, is a story about these two brothers and their relationship. And the challenge for us as writers is to keep focus on that and to investigate that from an emotional point of view.
Very interesting. And now that you said, how important it is as a writer to explore these characters, moving back for a moment to the creation of the film itself, I would like to know how involved were you in what would be the outline of the film, because the music and the songs are very important. In fact, everyone knows Prince of Egypt, so this is not going to be a spoiler, but there is a moment when Moses' sister sings the lullaby that you had written, and that triggers a very, very strong memory. So how involved were you during the creation of the script before writing the songs? Or maybe you wrote the songs first and the writers, the script writers, worked from your songs to develop the script. Which was the process?
It was a very collaborative process. As you know, The Prince of Egypt was the first animated feature done by this new film company of Dreamworks, one of whose founders was Jeffrey Katzenberg, with whom I had worked at Disney on the animated features Pocahontas and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I was actually recruited by Jeffrey to come and meet with him and his partners in Dreamworks, Steven Spielberg and David Geffen, and told that they had the notion to do an animated story, to do the Moses story as an animated feature. I have to tell you that initially I was a bit dubious because all I knew were films like The Ten Commandments, which are big spectacles but sort of silly in terms of the human content of these films. But then Steven Spielberg said, well, we're actually seeing it as a brother story, and we're going to be calling it The Prince of Egypt. And then that intrigued me. And so I think I was pretty much the first person on the film. And while the rest of the team was being assembled, I wrote the opening. I wrote Deliver Us. And that song, that musical moment existed for a long time sort of by itself. But then when the rest of the team, the directors and the writers were brought together, then all of us together worked out the outline. So in this particular instance, I was very involved with that, as I tend to be when I'm doing live musical theater, because that's how it works. You know, and some of the other film projects that I've done, frankly, I've been much less involved with the working out the story and have just, you know, been brought in and identified places for song moments. But in this case, I was, you know, very, very much a part of it. It was very collaborative, you know. And you cited an example of how we developed the ideas. This lullaby existed from the very, very early because I'd written this opening number. But then the idea that that was how Moses was going to be confronted with the truth of his past developed in terms of structuring the film. And then all along the way, songs were written as sequences were developed. We went on a wonderful trip to Egypt as a kind of research trip, which was fantastic and inspired a lot of a couple of the songs. You know, I remember being in the Sinai Desert and one of the directors, Steve Hickner, saying that he was hoping for a kind of anthemic song that the Hebrew tribes could sing as when they were released from bondage, as they were traversing terrain like this on their way out of Egypt. And the next day or the day after, we got to climb Mount Sinai and see the sunrise over Mount Sinai. And, you know, I was thinking about this, and that was the beginning of When You Believe. And then again on that trip, we visited a temple in the moonlight, the temple of Kamumbo, which is adjacent to the Nile. And I was there, and the moon was shining on this sort of white alabaster pillars, and you could hear the Nile, the rhythm of the Nile going by, and just the sound of that and the moonlight inspired All I Ever Wanted. So, you know, songs sort of developed with my collaborators along the way.
That's amazing. And now that you are talking about the creation of the music, one of the, I think the greatest things about these, you know, these songs is that it does have a really good mixture of Western sound and this kind of Egyptian sound. So apart from the inspiration that you got, you know, from seeing all those great sites, did you have to do some research, you know, exploring harmonies and melodies to make it sound so, you know, Middle Eastern Egyptian?
Absolutely, yes, very much so. Thank you for saying that, because it was a goal for the score for the film, and then again a goal for the adaptation into a stage show where there are, of course, a lot of new songs. And yes, I did a good deal of research and, you know, listened to the recordings of ancient Egyptian court music. You know, how they knew what that sounded like, I have no idea. But whether it was true or not, I believed it. Okay. And I listened to also, you know, a lot of Hebraic music. Oddly enough, what was really useful for me were sort of pop recordings that I got, you know, on the street, you know, bought a couple of CDs on the streets of Cairo. And the combination of pop rhythms, but as you say, more Middle Eastern harmonies and more Middle Eastern instrumentation and vocal style was very, very helpful to me. And of course, I was, you know, being aided by Hans Zimmer, the great composer, and who wrote the you know, the actual score, the underscoring for the film, using some of my themes, but some of the themes he developed on his own. And Hans, as we know from Lion King and other things, is a master at bringing musical culture into you know, the realm of more accessible pop and film composing.
And regarding instrumentation, as you said, I was listening when researching for this interview. I've also been listening to the recording of the show, and I noticed that, you know, there's some elements in the orchestrations that have been changed. Also, the tempo in some songs has been changed. Why did you decide to make those changes? Because I understand that you don't have the same kind of orchestra when you have a live show, but it's sort of the flavor. It's a little bit different. It's a little, yeah. There is a difference. They are both equally good, but I would like to know, why did you decide it? Why did you decide to make those changes?
Well, Guillermo, you basically have identified the reason, because from an economic point of view, one doesn't have the same orchestral resources. You don't have 90 players that you can't afford to run a show with 90 people in the pit, and so we realized we were going to have to make another choice from a practical point of view. And so the idea was, well, rather than try to imitate, try and fake it and make it sound as if there's this huge orchestra, what if we really emphasize the culture and use genuine Middle Eastern instrumentation, etc. And consequently, the orchestrator that I sought out is a wonderful orchestrator named August Eriksson, who's particularly good at that. He's just great at doing research into ethnic instruments and instruments of different culture, and then incorporating them into a score. And I was working with August long enough that actually certain things in the new songs were written for these specific instruments. So that was the decision, that since we couldn't have this giant orchestra, we would just go this different route. And I'm glad to hear you say that you feel it's equally successful, but you're absolutely right, it's certainly different.
And when writing, for those who don't know, musicals are often written in what is called a piano reduction, which has, everything that the orchestra is playing is written in a piano score, which makes it sometimes impossible to play everything that is written there. But when you were writing, because I know that you usually do the piano reduction because you're an accomplished piano player, did you take into account those instruments? Were there any changes that you made when approaching this orchestrator, when he told you, well, I'm going to use these, and it would be nice if you could include this kind of ornaments in the accompaniment? Where did you make those kinds of changes, of adaptations also during the creative process?
Yeah, well, it's actually a 3-part process. At least in my experience. So first, I essentially give the orchestrator a complete piano part, which represents kind of exactly what I play on the piano. And then, the orchestrator will assign instruments, and sometimes things change and counter melodies get written, etc. And then there's a piano reduction, as you say, of the orchestration, which, as you accurately acknowledge, is virtually impossible to play as a with just two hands.
Yeah.
And that's basically how it worked. But as I say, there were certain moments, for instance, the intro to Moses's, what we would call the I Want song, which is called Footprints on the Sand, was written specifically for oud. So I talked to August and said, I'd like to start with that. What's a good key for that instrument? And, where is it going to sound best? And we sort of went, had a bit of a back and forth. And then I wrote something that I hoped would work for that. And when you play it on the piano, it sounds kind of lame. I mean, it doesn't really work in the piano reduction, play it on the piano. But the hope is that, of course, it works in the orchestration. So there was a bit of back and forth like that.
Very interesting. Also, when writing the new songs, has this? It's often it's that when you write songs for a musical film, lots of them get cut. It happens. I think that it happens with all of the animated films that I've heard of. I don't know if that was the case with Prince of Egypt, but has this musical, this stage version, brought you the opportunity to reuse themes that that got cut in the movie, and also to make changes regarding the approach of the characters and the lyrics that you wanted to write, and some things that you would like to explore that you did not have enough time to do so during the creation of the film?
Well, to answer the second part of the question first, you're right. One of the things that was exciting about adapting the show for the stage is that instead of a 75-minute animated feature with 5 songs, I think, or 6 songs, it's a full 2.5-hour musical with an intermission, and consequently one has the chance to explore the characters in a good deal more depth and with more nuance. And there's a new character, added in the story, who is significant in the greater story, but wasn't which is the Ramsey's wife, Nefertari, who doesn't appear in the film at all. So that was one of the real enjoyable parts of it, and one of the things we were seeking to do. Now, in terms of restoring things that were eliminated from the film, first of all, you're absolutely right. For every musical project that I've ever worked on, either for movies or for stage, one writes several songs which don't wind up in the show. Yeah. As you're trying to find your way to what will work for this moment and what moments actually need to be sung, etc. There are always a lot of, false starts and cul-de-sacs, etc., that one goes down, and that's just part of the process. And that was true of Prince of Egypt as well. There were, as you suspected, maybe 4 or 5 at least songs that I wrote that then didn't wind up in the movie, either because we decided that those particular sections didn't need to be musicalized, or because they didn't accomplish well enough the storytelling for a particular moment, and therefore a whole other song or songs were written. I did attempt in earlier versions of developmental productions and versions of the stage show to bring back one of the tunes, which I thought was was a really good tune, and wrote new lyrics for it, and it showed up in a different place, and then ultimately we cut it.
Oh.
Because it didn't work in the show either. So the truth is that there are no songs or tunes in the show that had been in the movie or had been written for the movie and then were cut, although there's a lot of new music in the show. One thing that I was able to do was to expand certain of the numbers. Mentioned All I Ever Wanted is much more extensive and serves a much bigger storytelling purpose in the show than it did in the film, and a couple of other numbers expanded just because of musical theater. I'm going to reach. I see little lights on my. So I'm going to see if I can get rid of that for a second.
Sure.
No, I can't. All right. Well, people
just
see
sort of good.
Lights from the blinds, on the side of my.
It's sort of theatrical. So.
Okay, good. Yeah. Side lighting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, there is one great anecdote about when you wrote the original songs, which is that I think that one of the most iconic songs is the Plagues song, and that song was written because there was a budgetary issue. The studio just did not have more money, and they needed a very, very short moment to tell that. And you created what I think, to every friend that I have talked about Prince of Egypt, because they saw it when they were children and they really liked it, they always say, well, I just love the Plague songs. I just love it. So I don't know if you've noticed that something that was created out of necessity has become one of the most beloved songs of the film. And it's something very, very remarkable. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, thank you. I mean, that is, that's sort of the history of musical theater, that very often a song that's created late and out of necessity becomes, a favorite. Famously, Stephen Sondheim wrote "Send in the Clowns" for Little Night Music. That was, one of the last things he wrote, and again, just completely out of necessity, and finally, boom, there it was. And obviously, it's one of his, if not his most beloved and well-known song. But anyway, yeah, with the Plagues, it was a very specific assignment. We knew that we needed to have the, it's part of the storytelling. They needed to be in the movie. Mm-hmm. And it was the last thing that I wrote for the movie, because we weren't sure how we were going to do it. And then, as you say, their budget was being strained, and animation is very, very expensive per minute, particularly in those days when it was all hand drawn. It wasn't computer, it wasn't CGI the way it is now. Mm-hmm. I was specifically assigned by Jeffrey Katzenberg to write the Plagues, but that it couldn't be longer than 2.5 minutes. Mm-hmm. So that was my assignment, and it's why I wrote it that way. But you're right. You may know that my son Scott directed the stage production, because he's a wonderful stage director, mm-hmm. and he has a daughter who is about 2.5. At the time, she was like about 2.5. No, I guess she was maybe 3 years old. But anyway, the Plagues was her favorite, and she would like to come to rehearsal and dance to the Plagues. So yes, for some reason, but I think one of the things for me was, because I only had 2.5 minutes, just to make it very rhythmic and kind of drive through it, and very choral. Yeah. Really make use of the choral sound. So yeah, people seem to respond to it. It's just like it's the dance hit of the show. It's the Plagues.
Yeah, it's something very that happens a lot of times with artists, that you think that one song that you have written is going to be extremely successful in a show, and it people like it, but it's not the most successful. And something that you have written that you thought, well, this is just something I needed to move from point A to point B, suddenly becomes the biggest hit. But I think this is also one of the most exciting things about creating, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's one, and exactly what you said is so accurate. I learned, not to predict anymore which songs in a show of mine, if the show were going to work, were going to be the ones that sort of stood out, or became more popular, because you're never right. The composer is never right about it. But it's one of the exciting things about musical theater. You don't know, that particularly live musical theater, it doesn't really exist without the audience. That's one of the things that's so exciting and exhilarating about it, beyond, film, which is just up there and going along whether there's anybody watching it or not. Musical theater depends on the audience and sort of the heat of the exchange between what's happening on stage and the audience response. And you just, so you don't really know about what's going to happen with that aspect of it until the audience gets in there, and they always surprise you.
Yeah, that's so great. And now that you mentioned your son Scott, because that was going to be my next question, that you have had the chance to work with your son, who, by the way, for those who don't know, he's also responsible for the creation of the song, or the moment of the Wizard and I in Wicked, because
that is true. Yes. He didn't direct Wicked, but it was his suggestion. That song arose from his suggestion. Yeah, exactly.
So how has it been to work with your own son? Because I don't know if there is a good side and a bad side about working with your own relatives that maybe you would like to share about?
Yeah, I mean, there really isn't a bad side. Scott has directed a lot of shows that most of the things he's done have had nothing to do with me, and he has a very successful career. He's one of the directors whose work I really admire. But as you pointed out, through our life, I would go see shows he was working on early on in either workshop or early previews, and he would ask for my thoughts. And similarly, I would ask him to come to readings of things that I was working on and get his notes. So we're very accustomed to sort of giving our input to one another, often critical input, of saying to each other, look, that moment's not working, or I don't get that. So that consequently, when we were finally working on a show together, the sort of need to be polite or worry about hurting one another's feelings just didn't exist at all.
Correct.
We were very used to that kind of collaborative process. And, there were several things that we had to come to agreement about. We didn't ever really fight, but there were places where we had different points of view, which is part of the collaborative process, which is very helpful. But what had happened was Scott was invited by Disney to do their the live stage production of Hunchback of Notre Dame, which he did exceptionally well and has played in various parts of the world pretty successfully. And because of that, Dreamworks decided that Scott would be a good choice for Prince of Egypt, and they actually just came to me and said, would it be all right if we asked Scott to do this? Because I think they wouldn't have done it if I was uncomfortable with the working relationship. But I was delighted. I think he's a real visionary director. He has a fantastic visual sense. And when you see the show, you'll see that. And we have a very good collaborative working relationship. So I was really delighted to work with him.
That's fantastic. You have mentioned throughout this interview that you have learned a lot of things as a writer, during all those years that you have been writing music for shows and for films. But what would be the biggest lesson that writing this particular show, not the film, but the show itself, has taught you as a writer?
I think I come back to what we said earlier in the interview, the need for really focusing on the characters and their relationships, and nuance within it, and not allowing that to get swamped by big spectacular events. One of the things that I've learned over time is that it's very helpful in a musical for the central character to be aspirational, to want something, and to really be trying to get that, whatever it is. Not all successful musicals have them, but most of them do, and it's very helpful. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm just doing an interview, honey. I'll be out in a minute. But thank you. That's a grandson just appeared to ask me what I was doing.
It's okay.
But yes, but he agreed to. Once he knew, he was able to accept that answer. So I think that the challenge for this show, another challenge was to make the character of Moses, how to make a character who doesn't actually want anything at the very beginning, at least if he does, it's subtextual, how to make him aspirational from the beginning. And we had many false starts on that, and hopefully have succeeded. And I hope to be able to bring that sort of point of view to bear on other projects as I go forward. Those lessons learned.
Fantastic. And to end this interview, my last question would be, in comparison to, all the other shows that you can go see in the West End, what makes the Prince of Egypt unique, in your opinion?
I think there are a few things. It's very emotional.
Mm-hmm.
The audience gets really excited. They scream and cheer and stand up, and people are very, very moved by it. And I think now, actually, post-pandemic, when we've come through our own plagues and where we are, living at a time of clashing ideologies that are certainly this is true in America, and to some extent in the UK as well. I don't know about in Spain, but politically it's a time of clashing ideologies and people really not listening to one another and kind of dog-headedly and destructively going along. And of course, that's exactly what Prince of Egypt deals with. So it feels extremely current, and people seem to be responding to that.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. Well, Stephen, has been a very lovely interview. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Guillermo.